99% illiterate. Even some of the medieval European kings and queens did not write or read. But who are the Moors? How did this all start? It started in a sense with Muhammad. Therefore, we have to say something about him. Who is he? Muhammad, like Jesus, was a very extraordinary man. He transcended the race or sect in which he was born. He developed a universal religion. First of all, he accepted Jesus. Jesus, by the way, is part of the pantheon of prophets in Islam. They did not reject Jesus. Muhammad saw Jesus as a great prophet. He only saw himself as the last of the prophets. Muhammad also encouraged commerce. That attracted the townspeople. Muhammad insisted on equality and brotherhood among all men. He made a black man his right-hand man, Bilal. And he actually talked to the fair-skinned Arabs, because they were both dark-skinned and fair-skinned Arabians, that they should not treat their darker brethren with contempt. He insisted on racial equality, and he established that in his own life by making Bilal his black right-hand man. Muhammad also insisted on conquest, that we should go out into the world and conquer it, not destroy the people, but teach them a new life, bring them that religion. And he also did not seek to destroy the indigenous cultures, where he saw an indigenous culture where the Muslims entered and they saw indigenous culture. Even though they would bring their ideas, they did not completely seek to swing it around. For example, where in Walata, for example, one of the African places where Ibn Battuta visited, he went in and found that even though the Africans call themselves Muslims and they observed the festival days and various things, they still kept up their own cultural observances side by side. It's very important to note that, because many people wonder, why did Islam become so powerful? Because Islam has more converts than Christianity. It's hard to believe that, but it is true. And at that time in the world, Muhammad was just as unfortunate as Jesus. He was born among very bigoted little people, narrow-minded people. Now, I'm not saying anything against the Arabs or the Jews. People are people. People are usually narrow-minded and bigoted until a great leader arises among them and transforms them. Muhammad, in fact, nearly lost his life, because the little warring Arab tribes did not fully understand the nature of his mission, and some of them tried to kill him. Where did he flee? Into Ethiopia. And there, the beginning of the years in Islamic time begin, 622 AD, the time of the flight known as the Hijra. Now, the birth of Muhammad was around 571 AD, the flight was around 622, and he died in 632 AD. After he died, a fight broke out among the Muslims, because the Sunnis and the Shiites, there was a quarrel about hereditary succession and succession by merit, etc., and as a result of that, they split. That split has haunted the Muslim world up to this day, the Sunnis and the Shiites, and you will see how, in fact, it was to affect the Moorish occupation. Now, the Arabians then charged down into various parts of the world. Now, what was Africa at that time? Africa, the Moorish, most of the Moors, the Arabians came down into parts of Africa and started to try to turn people into Muslims. Some Africans resisted, some of them accepted Islam, some of them, the kings would make lip service to Islam, but they would not allow Islam to affect the common people. Whatever form it took in various parts of Africa, a fusion occurred between the black Moors, the Garamantes of the Sahara, who became very powerful. In fact, the Romans found they could not defeat them. They had chariots and the javelin throwers, etc. They became a very powerful, sophisticated people, at first farming and then building cities, etc. Those were largely the black Moors. However, there came another type, Libyans, etc., people who had come into the Sahara, fair-skinned Libyans who had mixed with black types. So you have both the mixed or tawny Moors and you have the blacker Moors. Into this came the Arabian, some of them fair-skinned, some of them dark, some of them becoming dark through intermixing with the women of the Garamantes and other African people. So it was a very mixed bunch. But when they attacked Spain in 711 AD, out of 7,000 troops, 6,000 were black Africans. Now, why did they attack Europe in the first place? Now, the Moors were intent, the Muslims were intent on conquering as much of the world as they could in order to bring their religion into the world, just as the Christians earlier in the Crusades had tried to conquer as much of the world as they could in order to bring Christianity to various people. Now the Muslims advanced in various places. They advanced into India, they advanced into China. Even to this day you have many Muslims in India, you have many Muslims in China. In my country, half the people are Muslims and Hindus, and the other half are Christians. Okay, so that they advanced into various countries bringing their religion. As they went into Africa, into marrying with various African people, they formed various states. In North Africa, there was a battle going on between the Muslim forces and someone by the name of Count Julian. There was a little Greek outpost called Ceuta on the edge of Morocco. And they kept fighting, but they could not conquer it, because even though it was small, it was almost indestructible. And eventually, however, Count Julian had sent his daughter to Spain. Spain was ruled by the Visigoths under King Roderick. And Roderick seduced Count Julian's daughter. Count Julian got very upset about it and decided to join with the Africans and the Arabs. Gave them ships and showed them how to get across at a vulnerable point. The first man to enter Spain, though he did not attack, was Tarif. That's how we get the term Tarif. Okay, because he actually imposed a duty. He went into Gibraltar, he imposed a duty on various places he went into, and that's how we get the word Tarif. He was followed by another man by the name of Tariq. Tariq led 7,000 troops, 6,000 African, 1,000 other types, Berbers, Libyans, Arabians, etc., up into Europe, and they defeated Spain. Within a short span of time, the Africans and the Arabs conquered a vast part of Europe, from Spain right through to the Pyrenees. In a very short space of time, they took over Sicily, Spain, Portugal. They took also a small part of France, though in France they had a very difficult time. General Martel repulsed them in France, so they got a very small slice of France. They set up courts. They set up courts in Africa, North Africa, and they set up courts in Europe. Now, because of the ideas of equality and brotherhood, they did not seek to make slaves of these people. Some Arabs, and it has to be pointed out, that the Sunni, the marvelous Sunni Abdul Rahman, Sunni Muslim, although he did not participate in the slave trade, some of the Arabs and Jews did start a white slave trade. Okay, so that you have some white women who were taken as slaves and sent to other countries. But on the whole, you had an insistence by law that the Jew the Muslim and the Christian should be treated alike. They did not destroy their legal system. They did not destroy their language. But they brought a whole body of new things into Europe. Europe did not have a single paved street at that time. Europe did not have a single lamp in its streets. Europe did not have a single public library, only private libraries for the elite. Europe did not have a single public market. There were one or two, yes, but they were not institutionalized body of public markets. They did not have public baths. All of these things were brought in by the Moors. And everything that could be translated in the world out of Egypt, which the Arabs conquered in 638 AD, out of India, out of China, out of the universities in Africa like Timbuktu, Sankore, and a range of other universities in Africa, out of ancient Greece and Rome, which had lost for a long time much of its sciences. These things were revived, translated, and brought up into Europe. Europe had 2 universities. The Moors introduced 17 universities into Europe. Europe was 99% illiterate, so was the rest of the world. A few people wrote and read in Africa, a few people wrote and read in Europe, a few people wrote and read in Asia, the same thing in America. I want you to note that Africa was not backward in relation to Europe. Africa had as many scripts as Europe. Let me repeat. Africa had the Meroitic script. It had the hieroglyphic script. It had the Akan script, both a drum script and a written script. It had the Mande script, which we find at Udmurtetek even 5,000 years ago. It had the Afaka script. It had the Vai script. Europe does not have any more scripts. Europe has very few scripts. Europe has the Roman script. It has the Greek script. It has the Celtic script, which is half and half. It's not entirely European. It has the Russian script. It has 1 or 2 more, just like the African. Many European tribes, just like many African tribes, do not have scripts. The English have no script. We do not write in English script. All we have are Anglo-Saxon sounds. We use the Roman script. The Spanish have no script. The Germans have no script. So it's not a question of being civilized and making up scripts. They didn't make up any scripts. Scripts were brought to them by conquering Europeans. The Romans conquered Britain, and when they conquered Britain, there were no books. There were no writers. In fact, Cicero said, and I quote him, and I think it's rather unfair, but I quote him because he said so. He said, these people are so ignorant, speaking of the Anglo-Saxon, that we are not even sure we can turn them into good slaves. Yet when I was at university, I was being told about how literacy, that the Africans were pre-literate, and literacy began in Europe. We have found Africans writing on the edge of the Sudan, in a place called Kuster. The dynasty of Tarseti, we have found them doing this 200 years before the first Egyptian dynasty. There is nobody else. In Sumer, Sumer was to come later. The earliest dates we have at Sumer or Babylon is about 2600 BC. We're talking about 3300 BC. So nobody can talk about the African being backward in this regard. Not at all. All these things were brought in, translated into Arabic, which became the language of science. Just as Latin earlier had been the language of scholars, Arabic became the language of science. And Arabic is not just used by Arabs. The Arabic script was invented when Arabia was completely black. It was invented by an African called Abul Aswan. It's recorded in the diaries of Ibn Khalikan, page 661. They are aware of that. So it's not something confined to a certain type of person. Okay, the Arab is not a race, just like the Jew. The Jew is not a race. You have black Jews and white Jews. In fact, the earliest Jews were the dark-skinned types who became, then you have Semitized people coming into that sect. Then you have, in later years, the European type, which became the dominant type, a later Jew. Likewise, among the Arabs or Arabians, you have the fair-skinned type and you have the darker type. And you find with mixtures with the African type, this became even darker. Into Europe they came, and they established 4 dynasties in the heart of Europe. They established the Umayyad dynasty, completely African, because when the Muslims started fighting among themselves, they would always go back to Africa to regroup. Let me give you an example. The Umayyad set up a dynasty in Europe in 715, and in 750 the dynasty collapsed. Why? Because the Shiites murdered the whole royal family while it was holidaying in Damascus. Then Abdul Rahman built up an African force, charged, he's a Sunni, charged back into Europe, smashed the Abbasid dynasty and renewed the Umayyad dynasty. And the Umayyad dynasty brought many things into Europe. We are not aware of how profound the influence of the Moors were on European science. In fact, I go so far as to say, were it not for the Moors, it is quite possible that the Industrial Revolution would have been delayed by at least a century. The Moors were the first to take water from the mountains and lead it into the private houses by means of lead pipes. They introduced air conditioning in some of the houses. They actually passed the air over a bank of flowers so that they introduced perfumed air conditioning. They were the first to introduce hot and cold water in the houses. They introduced windmills. Nobody had produced windmills knowing that the wind could become a source of power. They introduced mills, paper mills. They introduced the cotton industry into Europe. They introduced the rice industry. They wrote marvelous books on agriculture. You could see a range of them. They advanced that agriculture. They introduced irrigation systems. They introduced worm and pinion gears operated hydraulically. They introduced a range of inventions. Optics, the first eyeglasses in the world were introduced by the Moors. They introduced trigonometry, new concepts in trigonometry. They introduced algebra. Algebra, Europeans did not use algebra, it's an Arabic word. Algebra. Introduced algorithms. They introduced public markets. They introduced public baths. They introduced public libraries into Europe. There was not a single public library then in Europe. They paved the streets. They put lamps on the streets. You could walk for miles through Cordova by the flash of lamps. There was not a single lighted street then in Europe. These are the superior Aryans who invented everything. I am not attacking the European, mind you, because certain developments occur in certain places at certain times. Europeans have done marvelous things in science, but they have been arrogant enough to assume that they did these things because they were superior, or they did these things completely out of the blue. If you check it out, you find that when you go to the background of science, you find how much has been lied about. Dr. Finch recently did a study for the book I'm bringing out, Egypt Revisited, in July or August. Did a study of the Edwin Smith Papyrus where a surgeon, Egyptian surgeon, had started to rewrite a book which had been used or developed long before him. He did this in the 18th dynasty, around 1,650 years before Jesus. And he only did 1/3 of the book dealing with the head, the neck, the brain. Do you know what the Africans were doing? They had mapped the insides of the brain. They knew the locus in the brain where auditory information was being processed. They could test the pulse. Europeans, the Greeks, were not able to do this until 1,000 years later. Yet, when you read medicine, you hear Herophilus, the Greek, he's the guy who first tested the pulse. And when you read about this test, you see it exactly coming from the Egyptian. Now we have, in all honesty, not only for ourselves, but for all mankind, we have to put the record straight. Because that is the foundation of these myths of superiority. If we do not put them straight, the black will always think he did nothing. I heard my brother say we have to start from scratch, let us face it. And we will always have this arrogance and contempt springing from people who have no ground for arrogance and contempt. What we are here to do is not to prove blacks are superior. There are no superior peoples. We are here to establish that equality is no fantasy. It's no liberal cliche or sentiment. It is rooted in hard historical realities. In the world of the Moors came a number of things which are absolutely critical. I spoke to Congress on July the 7th, 1987. I had been called there because a Congressional Overseas Committee was looking into the workings of the Christopher Columbus Quincentenary Commission. This commission had set up its base. There were no Native Americans. They employed no Native Americans, no blacks. This was going to be a big commemoration in 1992 with just the Italians and the Spanish getting honor and praise for this so-called discovery. And as I pointed out to them, first of all, Columbus never put foot on the American landmass north or south. He only stumbled into the Caribbean. On August the 7th, 1498, 3 of his ships landed in South America, but he did not come off the ship. He said he had arthritis. And he sent message home that South America was an island. Just as earlier on the second voyage, it sent word home that Cuba was the continent. Just as on the first voyage, it came back to say that he was off the continent of Asia, and that the Caribbean was the Gulf of the Ganges. This is the man that we are celebrating in 1992 because he discovered us. He discovered America, thank God, because that enabled them to drag us out of the bush and bring us here and put us in a good footing. Taught us how to dress and how to speak properly. The absurdities, the lies upon which a whole civilization have been built. How can one sleep at night? How can one call a civilization Christian when it is built upon grave immoralities? It is not only us, the black, who carries the burden. The white cannot sleep properly if a civilization is built on lies. Therefore, we've not only come here to save ourselves, we've come to save the world. Because to expose these fictions is absolutely vital, as I pointed out. Mr. Columbus was using a caravel. Do you know what the caravel comes from? Boat. Columbus and Vespucci were using caravels. The caravel comes from the Moorish caravos. The instruments on their ships, the compass, the Moors had brought in the compass. It had been refined, or rather earlier it had been brought in, though they were to refine it further. The astrolabe had been brought in out of Asia, not out of Europe. The sails on the ships of Columbus and Vespucci were Arab Latin sails which Arabs and Africans were using on the Indian Ocean. So what was so marvelous about Christopher? He went out, he struck out for the latitudes of Japan, hoping to land in India. And then when he landed in the little islands in the Caribbean, he was so frightened he could not go back home and say, "Sorry, man, you wasted your money. I did not find the riches of India." Do you know what Columbus did? He sent his notary, Fernando Perez de Luna, among the ships and made every man sign a document that he was off the coast of Asia. And he threatened his men. If they went back home and said they had not found the edge of, they were not on the edge of Asia, if there were members of his staff, they would officers of the ship, they would be fined 500 maravedis, and if they were common sailors, they would be given 100 lashes and have their tongues cut out. He was not joking. Can't go back home. That's like what happened in my country. Sir Walter Raleigh, Queen Elizabeth's lover, First Elizabeth, went out to my country to find the Golden City. Didn't find it, went back home, and she chopped off his head. So Columbus couldn't go back and tell Ferdinand and Isabella, "I'm sorry." That's a lot of money went down the drain. And that story about the great gold, even as a young man, I heard that the gold was in my jungle because Orinoco, the Golden City, El Dorado, was situated in the Guyana jungle. Jimenez de Quesada, Queen Philip II, Sir Walter Raleigh, all of them came into my jungle searching for the Golden City and met with grief. So when I was 20 years old, I went myself into the bush with a friend of mine searching for the Golden City. Damn fool as I was at that. So it is this vision of gold, this greed, that drew ship after ship after ship in this direction. And so it wasn't because of the superiority of the ships. China reported that Africans had brought ships to them 2 centuries before Columbus. They had brought elephants in ships. Do you know what it is to take an elephant from Africa to China in a ship? It was not a dugout. Clearly not a dugout, and it was not the little ships, caravels of Columbus, because it would have been nice to see a herd of elephants on the Santa Maria. There would have been no celebration in 1992. Even the gun is not European. The first evidence we have of the fire stick, as it is called, is the Moor using the gun in India as the Muslims attacked India. The Europeans took it. They didn't have gunpowder technology, which had been brought out of China by the Moors. Europeans took it, and it became the weapon of great devastation. And look at their number system. The Europeans did not have ciphers. They had numbers, but they did not have ciphers, which are symbols for numbers, which are critical in the development of mathematics. Because to reach a certain height in mathematics, you cannot have a cumbersome letter system. Look at the Romans, who were in advance of the Greeks. How do they count? 1 is 1, 2 is 1, 1. There's no 2. It's 1, 1. 3 is 1, 1, 1. 4 is 1 V. Then 5 is the V. Then 6 is V1. 7, V11, 8, V111, it all over again. Letters. They did not have ciphers. We owe the ciphers we have today to the Moors. The Moors took it out of India. We do not know how it got into India. When I was speaking at Princeton 2 years ago, I pointed out that several mathematicians had told me that these were Hindu ciphers which the Moors took out of India. And I presented that. A scholar who had studied the Hindu number system said he only found 3 of these shapes among the Hindus, so some of the other shapes must have come from somewhere else. About a year later, a gentleman, a mathematician from Philadelphia, black mathematician, discovered in a book called Mathematical Recreations by Fred Shue a picture of figures, symbols on the step pyramid of Saqqara, where there were dancers and there were people, snakes, forming these exact numbers, these symbols, 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in Egypt. Now we don't know if it's a fraud. Okay, so I cannot say that it developed in Egypt, but the strange thing is that where they said it developed, we've only found 3 symbols resembling that, so we still don't know, but we know it didn't happen in Europe. Fibonacci in 1202 traveled to India, where he said he saw some of these symbols, but when he tried to introduce some of them into Europe as symbols that could be used, decimal numbers, the Europeans would have none of it. The church was in charge, and the church was superstitious, and the church said numbers are works of the devil. So that it was not used until the Moors introduced it into the commercial circles from wherever it came. For the time being, we will say it's Hindu until we find people who can tell us. I have sent out 6 mathematicians to pursue this matter, and we have not been able to go beyond that. But until we can find otherwise, it is clear that it was brought in by the Moors, and whether it originated in India or not, it was brought for certain out of India by the Moors. Now, that was not all. Every major thing, every point of excellence in the world at that time, industrial excellence, was where the Moors were. The carpets of Tulala were the finest in the world. That's where the Moors were. The leather of Morocco was the finest in the world, the tanneries of Morocco. That's where the Moors were. The blades of Toledo were the finest in the world. That's where the Moors were. The iron and brass that was the finest in the world was at Murcia. That's where the Moors were. All of these things. And they brought the finest sashes from Almira and the finest carpets in Tulala. And they brought this incredible agricultural development in Spain at the time after the Moors were kicked out of Spain. Spain went down. It never became the power it was under the Moors. They charged everything. They insisted that education was absolutely important. It was not so in the Christian world at the time. They insisted that baths were important. That was not so at the time. Some people in the church thought cleanliness is next to godliness was not introduced by the church. Okay, that was introduced by somebody who thought it was good sense. Because part of the Black Death had to do with the fact, there's a book called that deals with the dirt that developed in certain civilizations. You have to be very careful about that. This is not an attack on people. This is an attack on certain ideas, certain concepts that people had that were to profoundly affect them, and other people came in with different ideas. That is the nature of civilization. Primitive cultures do not advance easily because they are closed capsules of culture. Civilizations are open things. You're supposed to take into your system the very best that is available. If you want to study Africa and you want it to be profoundly affected by Africa, you don't eat Africa whole. You take the very best. That is why our lectures deal with the golden threads from Africa. That's why Egypt became great. Egypt drew on the finest things out of Africa. Its hieroglyphs, you could see, you could trace it back in various parts of Africa. You could see the various forms, the animals, etc., the religious ideas. We are now startled to find, when we look at Egyptian ideas of creation, and ideas of creation among the Dogon, ideas of creation among the Bambara, we begin to see the fantastic sophistication involved. The idea that after the primal matter, that there was a growth, a flowering towards consciousness, and that there emerged this incredible power that was the center of consciousness, God, who then reconstituted matter and gave a direction. And the form, the things that before were formless, things that before that were directionless. Then you hear in the Egyptian the beautiful poetry when God speaks, I am the settlements. They were the first to domesticate cattle. So there is no backwardness in the African. The tragedy is that we have become so colonized. Very special experience, that great conquest that enabled them to transform both Africa and Europe. I want to close by saying, and this is something that reminds me very much of Césaire in his great poem, Return to My Native Land, as he ends with these words, or words similar to these. It is not out of hatred or envy of any race that I proclaim the greatness of my own. It is because I know that no race has a monopoly of genius, intelligence, invention. It is because I know that the race of man is far from finished, that there remains a great deal to be done in the world. The race of man is only just beginning, and there is room for all of us at the rendezvous of history. Thank you. Just 10 minutes for questions.
Professor Ivan Van Sertima. Professor Van Sertima has agreed to at least 10 minutes of question and answers. We're going to ask you, please.
Traveling around the coast of the Amazon River, and they were cutting long shoes and lasty shoes from what is really that way.
We do not know that those are the Egyptians, okay? What I pointed out is that they found a map in Egypt, in Cairo, okay, that indicates that this map shows the correct latitudinal, longitudinal coordinates between the African Atlantic coast and the South American Atlantic coast, and that it shows the Trata River in Colombia plotted for 300 miles, and it shows a part of the Amazon plotted. Now this could either have been done in Egyptian times because there were masters of latitude and longitude, but it could also have been done in Moorish times because the Arabs had attacked Egypt and taken it over in 638 AD. One of the things I forgot to mention in my lecture, that some of the Moorish science is Egyptian science because they inherited Egyptian science. The Arab is not an Egyptian. Okay, he now occupies Egypt. Okay, just as the European is not an American, he's a later American. The Arab later occupies Egypt, but they drew on that science so that some of the latitudinal coordinate latitudinal, longitudinal coordinate knowledge could have entered Moorish science, so that when they were became very powerful in Europe and in Africa, you could have also had visits. So that map could be later than the map that involved the Olmec thing, where you have the Egypto-Nubian complex. So at the moment we do not know whether it belongs to the early Egyptian or the later Moorish. Yes, go ahead.
I was listening to Mark Arnold's show the other night, and the racist statement was made that he was telling the black feel that, so your African chief sold you all into slavery, and you left it like that. Could you respond to that?
Yes, there's something known as the domino effect. When the advance of European peoples in Africa reached a certain point, some people, in order to save themselves, allowed other people to be captured. Okay, the question about selling into slavery, I do not know details about that, but I do know that this has happened in Europe too. For example, when Hannibal was moving his army across the Alps towards Europe, towards Rome, Europeans attacked him. But when he was on the doors of Rome, Europeans turned against their own Europeans because they knew that Rome was the enemy, not the blacks. So they joined with the blacks to defeat the Romans. Okay, there are many complex elements involved in this. Some Africans who, in order to save their skins, allowed some people, perhaps their enemy tribes, into European hands, did not have any idea of what slavery was. You see, because slavery had existed in the world, but it's not the same thing. Like, for example, we have instances where a slave is a prime minister. You see, the word slave is a very curious word, so that you can't link everything else when you hear slave. You have people, for example, who would marry into another family, okay? A foreigner marrying into family. She may be called a slave, but she's not a slave. In fact, she may have more power than a citizen. We have instances, for example, in Asia, where a slave becomes a prime minister. We have an instance where you find that the major military commanders are called slaves because they are foreigners brought into a country. Okay. Now that does not mean that there are not Africans who did that. In a struggle like that, where people's lives were deeply threatened, it is quite possible that cowardly chiefs did let some of their people or enemy tribes into European hands. Yes.
You mentioned India as the birthplace of the number system, or there being evidence that Hindu culture was the origin. Is it not the case that the Dravidians were black, formed the foundation of Hindu culture?
Yeah, but you see, the Dravidians were defeated. The Mohenjo-Daro and Harappan civilizations were defeated eventually by Aryan invaders. Okay, so that we do not know. The problem that we face is that the Hindu, they say that it came out of the Hindu. This Hindu scholar tells me it does not, because he showed me their number system, and it doesn't have, with the exception of two which may be coincidental, it's so few among the others. We do not know. All that we know is that it was taken out of India, and that it is claimed now that while it's called Arabic numerals, it is not Arabic. We have established it is not Arabic. It was taken by Arab types into Europe. So that at the moment we are stuck with a problem, because we can only assume, since it was taken away from the Indians and it was taken out of the Hindu, that it is Hindu. But it may be that it goes back to very early time, and if it belongs to the Harappan period, it would be Dravidian. Yes. It's not a solved question, okay? It's an open question. Yes.
Could you give us some information of the origin of Jews and Catholics in Ethiopia?
No, I don't know anything about that. I'm not a Jewish scholar. I must tell you, I know of them as I pass through various areas that are contiguous to the black experience, but I'm not a scholar on Jews. Okay. I do know that in the Jewish sect is not race. There is no race. The Jew is not a race. As I pointed out to you, and I can only say this in broad terms, the sect that was in Egypt that apparently was persecuted by the Egyptians because it was its various ideas, perhaps certain of its practices and rituals were different from that of the Egyptian. It involved Egyptians. The Jews leaving Egypt must have left speaking Egyptian. Okay, so that the Jewish sect must have been largely a dark-skinned sect at the beginning in Egypt. But it is, since it is a sect with certain ideas and rituals, it's not a racial thing. They were not persecuted because of their race. So that perhaps largely became Semitized, so that the Jew did not remain largely black. You have the Semitic type Jew, etc. When Jesus, for example, is represented in Ethiopia, he has a Semitic nose, but he has woolly hair and dark skin. So he has a mixture of the Semite and the African. Yes.
About a month ago, I read in the New York Times that they discovered a mummy over 4,000 years old. And they said it was kept so immaculate that I think they even had the smile on it. Have you heard anything?
Oh yes, that is reported. Nobody has talked about it since, because there are two reports. The one that you mentioned, which appears in the New York Times, nobody can get information on that until about a year or two had passed, because the people who discover it will not talk about it. They will not talk about it until they publish a report on it. There's another discovery where they have found about seven people. They have found the scribe Horemheb. This is a statue of Horemheb, which is an African. The others, they would not talk about their race or anything like that, but they were found in a period, some of them 18th dynasty, where you have a dominant African type. But after the initial report, how remarkable it is, because they found certain things like the goddess Hathor and so forth among them, they just remarking it that it's an unusual find, but they would give no more details. Yeah.
One of the things that I've always been curious about during school is that when Columbus set out, there was a belief that the earth was flat or square or along those lines.
No, not at the time of Columbus. The Arabs had made it quite clear to the Spanish and the Portuguese that the earth was round. The Egyptians knew that the earth was round. The Egyptians had made that quite clear. The Arabs knew that the earth was round. The Africans knew that the earth was round. Many Europeans thought the earth was flat, but that was not true of all Europeans. There were quite a number of bright European scientists who knew that the earth was not round. However, because it has not become a very popular idea, Columbus, having relationships, his wife was Portuguese, those are people under the Moors. Okay, Columbus was very much aware of these things, and he persuaded the Spanish and the Portuguese that since the world was round, you could go far to the west and end up in the east, which was theoretically true, but you would need an airplane, not the Santa Maria. Okay.
Would you say it was in the time of Julius Caesar when the Aryans decided to discover the southern hemisphere around the time of Julius Caesar?
What southern hemisphere?
We'll talk about Africa and when the balance started.
No. The Greeks, Europeans were aware of Africa for a long time. The Greeks entered Africa in force. They had entered trickles, but they entered in great force around 520 BC under Alexander. That was long before the Romans. The Romans only entered Egypt just before and after Christ. You had Julius Caesar was much later, that is centuries later than the Greeks. So the Greeks had entered Africa, and as I pointed out to you with great respect, this racist thing that has developed here is fairly recent. People have had all sorts of notions, like among Africans there are notions that red people are devils, but that's just a superstition, just like Europeans had a superstition about dark peoples, but that had nothing to do with race. It was just images in the mind. Race racism as an institutionalized thing there, you actually believe that you're dealing with a totally different thing, like a sub-animal or a non-human and so forth. That is a very recent thing. Very, very recent. Yes. When I say recent, I mean 500 years or so. That's very recent in history. Yes.
Dr. Sertima, I'd like to start off by saying that I am second generation listening to you. My father listened to you, and here it is, I'm the second generation. I hope you're around for many more. I have a two-parted question, sir. The first question is, did the cross that's behind you, did that originate from the Ankhs? And also, would you like to elaborate what you mentioned on WLID about the fiber optics that a black man invented?
Well, you have the cross appearing in Africa long before it appears in the Christian thing. Of course, as you know, the concept of the Christ appears in Africa long before Jesus appears. So you have Christ figures before Jesus, the last and most powerful of the Christ figures. But you also have the cross with different, like the tree of life is the cross. This appears very early in Egypt. It appears early in Africa. Okay, I don't know if it necessarily grew out of the thing you talk about, because you do have, in many parts of Africa, you have the cross. It's supposed to be an intersection between the living and the dead. So it does become the tree of life. At the crossroads, you have the god of the crossroads, for example, like Legbe, etc. So the cross appears very early. Yes.
And the fiber optics.
In Bell Labs, there have been several breakthroughs that have been made by black scientists. I mentioned Bill Northover, whose mathematics change our understanding of glass and enable us to stretch glass from 4 feet to 6 miles, producing glass fibers as thin as human hairs, through which messages coded in pulses of laser light could move as fast as the speed of light. And that you have also in that same lab another black scientist who is able to teach us, took these glass fiber light guides onto the streets, and Cannon is his name, Thomas Cannon. He created all the tools that were used in the operation of laying them onto the streets. And another black scientist also at Bell Labs in New Jersey, Al Richardson, who took these glass fiber light guides onto the oceans and with the Bell cable ship, and was able to write the first guidebook to teach the world how to lay these glass fiber light guides on the ocean floor.
Sir, roughly 3 weeks ago, you mentioned WLID, and there were quite a few African Americans who contributed to making the bomb. Now, could you briefly discuss that?
Yeah, I don't know their names. I was told by Dr. Lloyd, yes, he's dead now, and he pointed out that I should not stress his work on the atomic bomb. First of all, it was secret, and secondly, he had no control over that one must remember other aspects of his work. He did mention there were 6 other scientists. There were 6 of them in all. 5 other black scientists who worked on the atomic bomb on the Einstein in New York, the Manhattan Project. He did not give me the names. The names are, however, in a thesis in some library. Somebody has pointed that out to me. But he did not give me the names of the black scientists who worked with him. He refused to discuss it in detail because he said it was secret. And I said, but Dr. Quarterman, how could it be secret after so many years? And he said, no. I am not going to talk about it. That is secret. But he was responsible for the building of our first nuclear facility at Oak Ridge. He's also responsible for what is known as the diamond window, which enables us to see certain things which we'd not normally be able to see with the human eye. He also was the first person to experiment with synthetic blood, but he said funds were withdrawn from him and he did not succeed in taking this to conclusion. The Japanese have since developed synthetic blood to be used in blood transfusions or changing the blood during operations. He's responsible for a great number of other things as well. But the question as to who these other people were, I do not know their names.
So, in other words, you're saying it wouldn't be documented?
It is documented.
So-
Somebody told me after lecture that they are aware of this, the document that